Today, we are going to take a virtual tour of the National Museum of Fine Arts along Padre Burgos Street in Manila. Some of you may recognize that as the Congress building from the 1950s to the 1970s, and that is correct. But did you know that this building, constructed at the start of 1918, was originally meant to be the National Library? This neoclassical structure was designed by two architects of the Bureau of Public Works during the American colonial era, Ralph Doane and Antonio Toledo, as part of the American urban planner Daniel Burnham's blueprint for the city of Manila. However, the Philippine legislature decided to move into the building, so another architect, Juan was commissioned to change the layout. And in 1926, the second regular session of the 7th Philippine Legislature opened here. And from being the National Assembly building in the 1935 Commonwealth, to its bombardment and almost complete destruction during the liberation of Manila, to being rehabilitated as the Congress building in 1950, to being the Prime Minister's office during martial law, and then the Senate in 1987, this landmark edifice was finally turned over to the National Museum in 1998. In 2010, the National Historical Commission designated it as a National Historical Landmark. The museum houses the artworks of old masters, modernist painters and sculptors in some 25 galleries, and starts with Juan Luna's Spoliarium at the old session hall of the House of Representatives. The old Senate Hall at the upper floor features an entablature of historical lawmakers and moralists done by the celebrated sculptor Isabelo Tampinco. Other galleries feature religious images, botanical prints, neoclassical sculpture, Rizaliana, World War II paintings, Amorsolo's rural landscapes, the GSIS collection, modern and abstract art, political and social commentary, and the sculptures of Guillermo Tolentino. It would take at least a day to go through all the galleries, so in this virtual tour, we will focus on 12 must-see masterpieces that should give you a flavor of Philippine history through the years and the art that represents it. Perhaps the main attraction is the Spoliarium by Luna, a massive oil-on-canvas painting which won one of 3 gold medals at the 1884 Exposición Nacional de Bellas Artes in Madrid. A feat that Jose Rizal wrote was proof of racial equality in the world of arts. The word spoliarium is Latin for the basement of Roman colosseums, those underground chambers where the carcasses of fallen gladiators are dragged by soldiers to be stripped of their armor and other possessions by scavengers. The painting depicts a sad and somber scene of spectators eager to take the spoils, and old people seemingly looking for their sons among the dying. Rizal likened Luna's work to the ordeal of the Filipino people under the Spanish yoke and their struggle with cruelty and injustice. Not surprisingly, he was inspired to start writing his novel, Noli Me Tangere, that same year. The Spoliarium was bought by the government of Barcelona in 1885 and stayed at the Museo del Arte Moderno until 1937, suffering damage when the museum was burned during the Spanish Civil War. Generalissimo Francisco Franco ordered a painting transferred to Madrid for restoration, and in 1958, it was donated to the Philippines as a gift of the Spanish government. Many further restorations and conservation efforts later, this magnum opus was finally displayed at the National Museum. Luna's compatriot, Felix Resurrección Hidalgo, won a silver medal at the same 1884 exposition with his entry Las Virgenes Cristianas Expuestas al Populacho, or Christian Virgins Exposed to the Rabble, which is currently on loan to the National Gallery of Singapore. Hidalgo was part of the Philippine Reform movement that included Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar, Asiano Lopez Jaina, Mariano Ponce, and other nationalists. Hidalgo's equally famous work, El Asesinato del Gobernador Bustamante, or The Assassination of Governor Bustamante, was a political statement so controversial that the painting was never displayed in Spain. Completed in 1853, this oil-on-canvas depicts an actual historical event when Governor General Fernando Manuel de Bustamante, having jailed his critics, including the Archbishop of Manila, Francisco de la Cuesta, provoked an attack by a mob of friars at his palace in October 1719, killing him and a son who tried to defend him. During that period in Philippine history, the church, principally the friars, stood as the only opposition to the governor, to whom the Spanish king had granted almost absolute power, and who, as head of the legislative, judiciary, and military branches, was answerable only to the monarchy. Writer Nick Joaquin points out that the incident was not so much a conflict of church and state as it was a demonstration of the clergy against a perceived dictatorship, an early exercise, if you will, of people power. Gallery 5, which is a homage to national hero Jose Rizal, exhibits two interesting works. One is a painting by Martino Abellana called Rizal the Reformist, an oil-on-canvas completed in 1960. Abellana was a renowned artist from Carcar, dubbed as the Dean of Cebuano painters and the Amorsolo of the South. There are a number of interesting elements featured in his painting. Two clay sculptures created by Rizal, the triumph of science over death and the triumph of death over life, were gifted by him to his friend Ferdinand Blumentritt. Rizal is shown using a wooden pen with a metal nib, belying the common speculation that he employed a feathered quill. A saber hanging on the wall contrasts with his long-held belief that the pen is mightier than the sword. The books displayed on his desk include the works of William Shakespeare and Webster's Dictionary, as befits a prolific writer like him. At the other end of this gallery are a number of actual sculptures, the most interesting of which is La Venganza de Madre, or Mother's Revenge, a rendering of a mother dog trying to rescue her pup from the jaws of a crocodile. Legend has it that this terracotta carving was inspired by an incident in which the puppy of Rizal's dog was actually devoured by a reptile. Created during his exile in Dapitan in 1894, this work is supposed to be an allegorical representation of Filipino patriots trying to save their helpless and defenseless countrymen from the tyranny of Spanish rule. Rizal started carving at the age of 5 and later in his life attended human anatomy classes at the Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Spain, the same school where Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dali were students. An equally significant painting of Hidalgo in the museum is actually a copy of the real thing. The La Barca de Acheronte, or the Boat of Acheron, was an 1887 oil-on-canvas work that was Hidalgo's most awarded piece, winning the gold in the Exposición General de las Filipinas in Madrid, the silver in the 1889 Paris Exposition, and other honors in major European art arenas. Done in a neoclassic style, this painting features a boatman of classical mythology, ferrying condemned souls across the river Acheron and towards the gates of hell. Inspired by a reading of Dante's Inferno, Hidalgo paints the dark, sinister ferryman, glaring at the figures who are confused and in turmoil, exuding an air of uncertainty as to their final destination. This masterpiece, which reflects a theme common to ancient Greek and Etruscan mythology, was purchased by the King of Spain in 1893, and to this day remains on display at the Museo Nacional de Pinturas in Madrid. There is an ongoing debate about why the Philippines has not claimed this national treasure, but in any event, La Barca de Acheron was finished in the same year that Rizal published his Noli Me Tangere, which suggests to some that Hidalgo's painting was also an allegorical interpretation of the colonized Filipinos' struggle and hell-like journey under the Spanish regime. A fascinating, if gruesome, exhibit in the museum is the portrait of Padre Francesco Paliola, an Italian Jesuit who arrived in Mindanao in 1644. Devoting himself to missionary work among the Subanon Lumad, he learned both Visayan and the native Subanon dialect and set up Christian settlements in the Zamboanga Peninsula. He was, however, killed in 1648 by a native leader who had turned away from the Catholic faith, and an anonymous artist painted this ghastly and shocking incident, showing Padre Paliola with a dagger in his neck while serenely holding a crucifix. A common depiction in the portraiture of martyred saints, the original painting is displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Manila inside the Bangko Central complex. Juan Luna's Portrait of a Lady is an undated painting that art historians believe was composed in Paris in 1890. It is a dreamy impressionist rendering of a woman, assumed to be his wife, Paz Pardo de Tavera, lounging in bed, covered with white sheets, clutching a rosary, and with a prayer book by her side. Some curators allude that she may have posed right after a sexual interlude, pointing to her flushed cheeks and the slightly undone nightgown that reveals part of her right breast, a kind of 19th century wardrobe malfunction. The contrast between her seductiveness on the one hand and her piety on the other is said to be a Victorian concept in art. There is some debate as to whether the woman is in fact Luna's wife, who had a darker complexion and perhaps even masculine appearance, or a favorite model of his named Angela Douche. Others have proposed, however, that the woman is his idealized version of his wife, and the portrait a romanticized depiction of their otherwise troubled marriage. It is well known that the temperamental Luna shot his wife and mother-in-law in 1892 in a fit of jealousy, suspecting her of an affair with the Frenchman Monsieur Dussac. Juliana Gorricho, the mother of Paz, who was initially opposed to the marriage, had been living with the couple and funding household expenses which the artist, with his erratic earnings as a painter, could not afford. His money woes, the death of their second child, and the divorce that his wife sought, all combined to bring tension to the Luna marriage, and it all came to a head on September 1892 when an enraged Luna, paranoid with the thought that the Pardo de Tavera family were all conspiring to take his wife and son away from him, killed both women. Months later, he would be absolved and freed by a Parisian court, which ruled that he was merely guilty of a crime of passion. The intrigue does not end there. Before this painting was finally donated to the National Museum, its ownership passed from one individual to another, all of whom suffered illness, death, or misfortune. Its first owner, Manuel Garcia, had a business that suffered a reversal, forcing him to sell it to a Betty Bantug Benitez, who met a tragic road accident in Tagaytay. The painting then came into the possession of art collector Tony Nazareno, who suffered an illness and sold it to Aimee Marcos, who had a miscarriage. Whether Juan Luna, known like his brother Antonio for bouts of violence, cursed this painting in the throes of his desperation and brought a series of setbacks upon its succession of owners remains a question. What could be a more appropriate painting to view than one of the very building we are taking this virtual tour in? In 1945, Fernando Amorsolo created his Ruins of Legislative Building, one of the many portrayals of the ravages of World War II on the stately colonial-era edifices of Manila. Amorsolo apparently spent the war years in his home near a Japanese garrison and sketched many vivid images of the city's destruction from his window and rooftop. This particular work, which shows the legislative building crumbling down from bombardment during the liberation of Manila, is a stark contrast to his paintings that we are more accustomed to viewing. Bucolic scenes from rural country life like planting rice, fruit pickers under the mango tree, and the Lagang Bukid. These pastoral depictions were replaced by scenes of tragedy and death. But even in this particular work, the devastation is set, postcard-like, against a beautiful sky and serene surroundings, as if the folly of war was juxtaposed with fleeting clouds that presaged a better future. Vicente Manansala depicts the celebration of the first Mass in the Philippines with his painting Planting of the First Cross, commemorating the landing of Magellan in Cebu in 1521. This work was commissioned by the national government in 1965 to celebrate 400 years of the Christianization of the islands, as the actual introduction of the Catholic faith was in 1565 with the arrival of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. The original cross still stands in a special memorial in the city of Cebu and is a favorite tourist destination. In this painting, Manansala captures the Spanish soldiers and the tattooed natives, who appear both curious about the ceremony and suspicious about the intentions of the foreigners. Their angry stare contrasts with the determined look of the Spaniards as they plant the symbolic cross for the first time on Philippine soil. In 1953, the then director of the Philippine General Hospital, Dr. Aguerico Sison, commissioned Carlos Botong Francisco to create a painting that would depict the development of medicine in the Philippines. The artist produced a monumental 4 panels of oil on canvas that illustrated the history of ancient medicine during the pre-Spanish era to its evolution from the Spanish period, the American occupation, up to the modern period of the 1950s. This masterpiece was displayed at the entrance lobby of the hospital, where the humid atmosphere and thousands of patients who passed the crowded foyer daily would soon deteriorate it and necessitate successive restoration efforts in 1974, 1991, and 2006, before it would be transferred to its new home at the National Museum. In 2011, the paintings were declared a national treasure and an irreplaceable part of the institutional heritage of the PGH. Interestingly, professional photographer Benigno Tola III created full-scale reproductions of this massive work, which now hang at the hospital's lobby so that passers-by can continue to appreciate its historical significance. At level 3 of the National Museum, one finds the old Senate Hall, a grand chamber that soars 3 stories to the top, almost cathedral-like. Redesigned by the architect Juan Arellano in 1926 from the library that it was originally meant to be, the hall is dominated by a series of magnificent Corinthian columns and pilasters, a mezzanine gallery for the public, precast ornamentation, and a spectacular hardwood ceiling. The most celebrated Filipino sculptor of the time, Isabelo Tampinco, was commissioned to create an entablature with figures of the great lawmakers and moralists from antiquity, biblical times, and the 20th century. Justinian, Charlemagne, Apolinario Mabini, Datu Kalanshao, Pope Leo XIII, Moses, Hammurabi, Ramesses, Augustus, and other historical figures. At the moment, the old Senate Hall also contains Carlos Botong Francisco's last and most monumental work titled Filipino Struggles Through History, commissioned by Manila Mayor Antonio Villegas in 1968. Once gracing the Bulwagang Katipunan Ceremonial Hall of the Manila City Hall, this panoramic work of 10 canvases chronicles the history of the country from pre-colonial times to the Spanish and American eras, the independence, the dark days of Japanese occupation, and post-war modernity. Botong's epic artwork sustained damages due to plumbing issues at the Manila City Hall. In 2013, it was removed from the City Hall for restoration work and eventually transferred to the National Museum in 2018 for permanent display. A tarpaulin replica now hangs in its stead, although the current mayor, Isko Moreno, has publicly called for the return of the original. Juan Luna, Felix Resurrección Hidalgo, Fernando Amorsolo, Jose Rizal, Isabelo Tampinco, Martino Abellana, Vicente Manansala, Carlos Botong Francisco, and many more. They were painters, sculptors, artisans, and national heroes who wielded their brushes, fashioned with their chisels, and played their roles in history. In so doing, they not only produced these marvelous works, but also shaped the culture and heritage of our country. Their art and their deeds will not be forgotten. They remain preserved in the hallowed halls of our National Museum for all generations to see.